Father, once more we thank you for your great love towards us. You send us little messages here and there that we can understand, and we see you're really there, you're really watching, you're really taking care of things. We thank you. Bless us now as we take in once more your real word that shows us where the false is in front of us also. Help us to see the difference. And then let us put all of this aside and move back to your gospel, the truth of Jesus. We thank you in his holy name. Amen. I received an email just a couple days ago, and the person said they were listening to a presentation on the feasts by one who knows, because they're one of the top names of the ones who've ever promoted this. And he wasn't asking me questions. He was writing to somebody else and letting me be in on the conversation. And one of the first things he said was, you say in this presentation that Ellen White was not told everything. And so here we are again. Just a couple of days ago, I'm getting this brand new, fresh. Ellen White did not have the light. So this is not something that's growing old. It's not something I heard 40 years ago and it disappeared. I'm getting an email this week on it. Ellen White didn't have the light. Well, of course, the people never say neither did the pioneers. I haven't heard that one yet. But if she didn't have it, then obviously the pioneers didn't. So who in this church had the light? Nobody. See? So this whole church was in the dark on this subject. That's what we have to understand these people are saying. The whole Seventh-day Adventist church was in the dark. And it was in the dark until these people popped out from someplace. And so let's think about this for a moment. I have a question for the people who think that that is the truth, that Ellen White didn't have the light. I have a question for them. All of them. Every one of them. And I would like to have an answer. Now, I'm not ready to give the question yet. I want to give a little background for the question. What is light? Doesn't that have to come from heaven? Come from God? And the only way it reaches us is Jesus Christ. That's got the name of the Bible. The Spirit of prophecy. Jesus. He is the Spirit of prophecy. It's his testimony. The testimony of Jesus. Now, Ellen White was alive for a long time, receiving messages from him, writing them down for the people. Do you think he had enough opportunity to present what we as a people need to do our work? Why would he leave something out? What would be the reason for that? Well, I don't have an answer for that question, and that's not my question to these people. I have a question they can answer. Maybe. All right. So now light comes from Jesus. He gave it to Ellen White. Is that light going to change? Impossible. Impossible. If you change light, it becomes darkness. So the light can't change. So whatever he told her, that's the truth. That's light. Now, light can be increased, but the only way it can be increased is if it's the same thing. So we have to have all of this in our head as we're dealing with this. She didn't have any light. Well, then if she didn't have any light on this subject, then whatever the feast days are that they're talking about, it's got to be something that was never light in the Adventist church. Never. It's got to be something brand new to the Seventh-day Adventist church. Think about that for a minute. Something brand new for the third angel's message. How can that be? That there is something new going to be added to the third angel's message. That's still not my question. What would have to happen in order for something new to be given to this church in addition to what God gave to his prophet, the messenger? What would have to happen? He'd have to have another prophet. Do you see it? He would have to have somebody he could have that would have the authority that Ellen White had to say, this is new light. The same kind of light I gave Ellen White. It would have to be at least that kind of authority. But there's something else. If this goes beyond the third angel's message with a whole new thing we were never told to tell anybody, it would have to be beyond Ellen White's prophetic gift. It'd have to be something bigger, something higher. So my question to the people who think they have new light is this. Here's the question. Who on this earth did God give that new light to? I want a name. Because that person has to have the prophetic gift, like Ellen White had. And I want to know the name of that person. And with all the people in that movement, there ought to be one person that knows who got this light in the first place. I want to know who that is. And I think I have the right to know who that is because God does not do things in secret. So I want to know who God gave the light of this feast message to because I want to talk to that person. Yes, I want to talk to that person because I have questions for a prophet. And if they can't produce a person who Jesus spoke to and said, I have a message to you for the Seventh-day Adventist people to finish this work. If they can't come up with a name, I have to think there has to be another alternative that gave them the message other than Jesus. That's the only place I can go with this. It either came from Jesus or it came from another source. That's plain and simple. Now, if somebody stands up and says, I'm that one person that Jesus gave the message to, that makes it tangible to me. That makes it possible that he really did it, and I want to talk to that person. Because there are several things that have not happened that the Spirit of Prophecy said must happen when a new prophet comes. They have to happen. And I want to know if this person did any of those. I cannot conceive in my wildest dreams there's somebody out there is so foolish that they're going to say, it was me. Jesus gave me the prophetic gift. I'm the new prophet. I cannot conceive of that. But if there's somebody that's that foolish, we'll find out. We'll find out. Talking about light, that's my challenge to every feast keeper. Right now, today, that's my challenge. Tell me the name of this person who has the authority of Ellen White to tell us it's really light. Okay. In Acts of the Apostles, Page 190. In the light of the gospel, light, there's the word, see, light. We know when she says the light of the gospel, that's real light. The gospel is real light. In the light of the gospel, the ancient rites and ceremonies committed to Israel, to who? Had gained a new and deeper significance by what Jesus did. Okay. It says that which they shadowed forth had come to pass. And those who were living under the gospel dispensation had been freed from their observance. Is that difficult to understand? Do we know what she means by the ancient rites and the ceremonies? Is there any mystery about what she's talking about? Did she have any light on that subject? Well, she had enough light to write this. And she says, those living under the gospel, who's that? Had been freed from the observance. What does that mean? That nobody needs to keep them. Nobody, if they're under the gospel. Now, if they're listening to something else, we can't talk to them anymore. But we're talking about those who are in the gospel of Jesus Christ. They are freed from their observance. And so we know when the people came around telling Paul, well, we need to do them. What was your reaction? He said, what in the world are you talking about? We've been freed from all of that. Do you know that none of them historically, no one could prove this, that none of them said, well, it was just the sacrifices that stopped. We're still doing everything else. There wasn't one person in history that said that. But they did say something very interesting. They turned it around a little bit and says, we need circumcision. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with the sacrifices. We need to do circumcision, but circumcision was the doorway into the ceremonies without sacrifice. That's what they thought. That's how they tried to fool the church and fool Paul. We will do not the sacrifices, but everything else. And he said, no, you can't separate them. You can't separate them. You only have a feast because the sacrifices had to have a place for unbelievers to see it. If they had kept the commandments of God, they would have needed none of this. But since they didn't keep the commandments, God had to say it to them, and then he had to give them the law in written form, and then he had to put statutes, other laws, to tell what the big law was all about, and because they wouldn't do all of that, he also gave them some feasts so they could see it. But all of it required sacrifice. All of it, because you can't have salvation without blood. See? So that's very fast. Now, I want to take the rest of today, which I have to notice what time it is here, to finish this series. Because I'm not going to do this anymore. We don't need to be talking about error all the time. We need to get back to the truth and talk about what the Father and Son are doing and how they're doing it, so we see it works. So what I'm going to do with the remaining time we have today is talk about 20 or so of the major errors that these people are teaching. Now, I'm not going to discuss anymore as if they had something to talk about, all the things they believe, because it's not worth going back there and talking about all these things that are wrong. Let's just point blank hit it. What they're saying that can't possibly be. So let's look at it. Number one. It's being taught we must keep the feast days. Now I said plural. Now notice they do not call themselves feast days keepers. They call themselves feast keepers. And that's kind of ambiguous. What do you mean, feast keepers? How many? They never say. But if you push them hard enough, they'll say, well, there's only 2 that haven't finished. One is the Day of Atonement, and one is the Feast of Tabernacles. That hasn't come yet, so that's all we're really concerned with. Now, I don't think a person, according to the Bible, can only be concerned with just 2 feasts. There were 7 partitions, 3 feasts, 7 elements to it. You can't separate them out and say, I'm just going to do 2 of them. Okay? So there's something wrong with that saying that we must keep the feast days, implying all of them. There's nothing in the Spirit of Prophecy that says to do that. All right, I'm just going to move through here quickly and give you things to study on your own if that's what you want to do. If you want to know more about this, go ahead, dig in. I'm just telling you that when you look for something, look for a Spirit of Prophecy quotation. It's not there. The pioneers don't have any quotes to work with backing up what these statements are. They always say the opposite. The opposite. Now, the Catholic Church, who these people don't like, these people say if it's Catholic, we don't want it. One of the things they teach is the Catholic Church did away with the feasts. I have read a few history books in my time. I have never seen where the Catholic Church took away the feasts of the Jews. How would they do that? The Christians weren't keeping the feasts. Who were they going to take them away from? Were the Jews keeping them? They all ended in AD 70. You can't keep a feast if you don't have a temple, if you don't have a priesthood, if you don't have animals to kill. You can't keep feasts without the whole system together. That's why they try to take away the sacrifices and say, yes, you can. But no, it never happened in history. It has never happened. But the Catholic Church did not take away the feasts. That's another error, they say. Here's what it says in Great Controversy. The very beginning of the great apostasy, this is 289, the very beginning of the great apostasy was in seeking to supplement the authority of God by that of the church. So not only God's word, but something added. And then she says, Rome began by enjoining what God had not forbidden. So if God didn't say something, we can do it. That's really kind of strange, isn't it? If he didn't say, don't do this, don't go and see Gone with the Wind this week. If God didn't say that, you can go see Gone with the Wind. That's what they taught. And still do. And then Ellen White says this, and she ended by forbidding what he had explicitly enjoined. That's the Sabbath. They forbid their church members to keep Sabbath. They said, keep Sunday. So they turned it all around. But notice the 2 principles. If God didn't say anything about it, you can do it. If he said don't do it, you can do that. Now, didn't God say in the Bible, Spirit of Prophecy and Pioneers, that the whole system of the Jewish religion ended at the death of Jesus? Doesn't he say that? Yes. This is a complete error that's being taught. Let's continue here. Error number 2. The teachers are declaring the seventh-day Sabbath is one of the feast days. Now, we have already talked about this. I just want to add another little thing maybe we didn't say. How many annual Sabbath days are there in the Jewish system? Leviticus 23, there are 7. With the seventh day Sabbath, that makes 8. Now, here's the problem. Are any of the other the other annual Sabbaths, are they feasts? They're not. They're Sabbaths. A Sabbath is not a feast. Somehow the feast people have missed that. A Sabbath is not a feast. Any kind of a Sabbath. A Sabbath is a rest day. A feast has to have blood to portray the work that Jesus is doing. That's what a feast is. So to say the seventh-day Sabbath is a feast because it's a Sabbath like the other ones, there's no way to prove that, because the seventh-day Sabbath is a day of rest, just like the other Sabbaths, and none of them are feasts. Do you see that? None of the Sabbaths are feasts. So when they say the Sabbath is the first feast day, that is a complete error. There's no way that can happen. The Sabbath is a memorial of creation. That's it. It's not a shadow. It's not a type. It's its own real thing. Error number 3. They claim that the feast days are equal to the seventh-day Sabbath. So if God commanded us keep the seventh day holy because it's a Sabbath, they say if he commanded you to keep the other Sabbaths, they also are holy. And because they are holy and the seventh-day Sabbath is holy, they're all holy. That means they're all equal. You have to rest the same way on all of them. Well, where they're going with that is, if you get rid of the seventh-day Sabbath, you have to get rid of the annual Sabbaths, which is what the Sunday keepers do. But if you keep the annual Sabbaths and the seventh-day Sabbath, they're still equal. You're keeping all of them. But what one does, what the seventh-day Sabbath does, the other ones do. They either all go or they either all stay. That's what they teach. That's another error, because they're different. The seventh-day Sabbath is part of the moral law. It's eternal. The annual Sabbaths were only for the Jews. And the Jews are no longer God's people. How many times does a person have to hear that? It's an error. What they say is absolutely wrong. Error number 4. It's also claimed because the feast days are found in a few Bible chapters with the Sabbath, it's impossible for the feast days to pass away, as it is for the seventh-day Sabbath. And there are some of those where the annual Sabbaths are listed with the seventh-day Sabbath. But that is also an error. Leviticus 23 is the basic place they go. And Leviticus 23 begins by saying what the seventh-day Sabbath is. Then it talks about the annual Sabbaths and the feasts. It's all separate. And in verse 38, after verse 37, where it says, these are the feasts. That's what it says, verse 37. These are the feasts. In verse 38, it says, but. Okay, it doesn't use the word but. It says this Sabbath of this verse is different. This is a different Sabbath. The word translated from the Hebrew in that place is besides. There's the English word they use. Besides the Sabbaths. That means it's not one of those. Besides. And every one of the pioneers used this verse to show the seventh-day Sabbath is different from the annual Sabbaths. So even though they didn't have any light on it, they wrote on it anyway, and they explained this verse. All right. Error number 5. It's claimed that the feast days were given to remind us of the seventh-day Sabbath. Well, what did they do before the feast days? That's what the Sunday keepers say. Nobody kept the seventh-day Sabbath before Moses. Every Sunday keeper teaches that. Well, if they didn't teach him before Moses, then how did they ever figure out what the first day was? You can't come up with the first day of the week in the time of Moses. You have to go all the way back to creation week. That's the only first day there is. The first day of creation. Okay? So there are lots of arguments here that you can come up with to show the big errors here. I'm not trying to give you a list of ways to show you how these are errors. I just want you to see these cannot be sustained, these statements, by the Bible. All you have to do is think a little bit and start looking up Scripture. The feast days have nothing to do with the seventh-day Sabbath. Error number 6. It is claimed that the seven feast days, and that's what they say, is 7 feast days. They don't call them 3 feast days divided up into 7. It says the 7 feast days were kept by the angels in heaven before Lucifer fell. Yes. Can you imagine the feast people believe this? All of them in that group of people believe. Because whoever it is that told them, they accept their authority the same as Ellen White. Do you see my question now? I want to know who that person is. Why do they expect someone in this world today to talk with the same authority as Ellen White? I want to know who that is. The angels are supposed to have kept the feasts in heaven before Lucifer fell. And because it was there, it was given to Adam before he sinned. That's what they teach. And the way they get there is so bizarre. I've been tempted to give 2 meetings on it just to show what they've done, because one Hebrew word, it's the same Hebrew word the lunar Sabbath people use to prove the lunar Sabbath. The word is moed. And of course, moedim, they use the plural because they are smart enough to know that if you say it in the plural, that means more than one. They say the word moed means feasts. But you can't say feast saying moed. You have to say moedim, feasts. See? So they play these little tricks. You don't have to keep up with it. I'm just telling you what they do. You can, if you have to read it for yourself, read some of their literature. And you'll say, look at this. What in the world are they doing? Now, the word moed, they say means a gathering, coming together, an assembly, an appointed time. Those are all true. The word moed means all those things. But they say when God called the angels together for a meeting, that's a moed. Okay, it's a moed. It's a gathering. But they say the word moed means feast. So they say, see, the angels came together for a feast. Well, that's ridiculous. No Hebrew student could ever come up with such a thing. It's only people who don't know Hebrew, and they heard somebody who said they have new light. And they accepted that as the truth without ever checking. Who told you it was new light? Did Jesus tell you that? Has he had anybody else to acknowledge that you were talked to by Jesus and he gave you new light? How do we know that? So, God has called angels together for meetings. But they were not celebrating feast days. Because every feast day that's ever happened on this earth, every real one, you've had to kill an animal. Yes. So were they killing animals in heaven before Lucifer sinned? Isn't that a ridiculous thought? Was Adam killing animals before he sinned? Absolutely ridiculous. But they play their little trick and they say, well, feast doesn't mean killing animals. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. In the Bible, it's the only way you can have a feast is to kill an animal. Error number 7. The feasts are part of the plan of redemption. And so the feasts were explained to Adam when he fell, because God told him the plan of salvation. Now, how in the world can anybody arrive at something like that? They're just inventing all this stuff. And we're going to see they dip down into places you can't even imagine they could find a feast. But here we have this wild theory. There is not one word in Scripture that says Adam understood the feasts were part of the plan of salvation. There's not a word. If the feasts were given to the Jews, you mean to tell me Adam was a Jew? It's too soon. Too soon. There were no Jews before Abraham, before Jacob, before, well, you know what that all is. There had to be somebody named Judah. He's the first Jew. No feast before Judah. And even they didn't keep them in the desert. Nobody kept the feasts until Joshua in the land of Canaan. It just takes a little bit of Bible reading to come up with all of this. So we have seen error number 7. Error number 8. It's being taught by these people that Jesus kept the annual feasts. And he not only kept them, but he traveled around telling people to attend them. Yeah, that was part of Jesus' mission, to tell people, this is my new religion, keep the feast. See? I'm going to read you where they get this. I'm not reading you all the places they use because they're so ridiculous. I don't want your brain to suck them in. But you can look them up if you want to see where in the world this stuff came from. It did not come from the Spirit of Prophecy. I'm going to read you one so you can see how it works. This is in the Review, July 7th, 1896. Jesus traveled up and down the breadth of the land, giving his invitation to the feast. Let's say, see, there he is telling him go to the feast. That's not what's being said here. This is not the only time Ellen White or the pioneers ever talked like this. Jesus told the people to come to the feast. What is the feast? Have you ever heard of a supper? The marriage supper of the Lamb? Where he supplies everything for the feast. His invitation to the feast is the gospel invitation for eternity with him. That is so simple. How could anybody think he's talking about the Jewish feasts? Oh, come to the feast. That's what I'm here for, just bring you to the feast. To see some animals die. Come on. This to me is so silly. I can't even imagine how people are believing this stuff, but they are. So we have to say something, because if they've trapped this many, they're going to trap some more if we don't say something. Error number 9. They say that only the sacrifices ended, but all the feast days are to continue to the end of time. And I hear this from certain people every time they write something about the feast, no matter what it is. They keep saying, the burnt offerings ended. Yes, the burnt offerings ended, but that's all that ended. The feasts are still here. Every time, that's what they're doing. And they say they don't subscribe to the feasts. Well, I want to know what they do subscribe to. It can't be the Bible. It can't be the Spirit of Prophecy. What are they subscribing to? It's not true. The sacrifices ended, but the feast didn't. No, everything ended at the same time. It was a whole system. There is not one statement in Spirit Prophecy that says the sacrifices ended, but the rest continued. There's not one sentence like that. Do you know the trick they play on people? They use the sentences that say the sacrificial system ended, period, and then it goes on. And they say, see, she didn't include the feast. Well, of course she did. You can't have the sacrifices without the feast at a certain point in history with the Jews, but you certainly cannot have the feasts without the sacrifices, period. So when Jesus took the sacrificial system away, the feasts had to go too. There's nothing left over. So that's error number 9. I'm tempted to start giving you quotations on that from Ellen White, but I can't do it. We have to finish this today. Okay. Error number 10. We've already said this, but I want you to see that it's a separate error. They claim that the feast can be separated from the sacrifices. It is true that the sacrifices can be separated from the feasts, because Abraham sacrificed and he didn't have any feast. Adam sacrificed and he didn't have any feasts. Lots of people sacrificed without feasts. But you cannot have a feast, a Jewish feast, without a sacrifice. That cannot be done. As a matter of fact, if you take the 7 elements of the 3 feasts, you will find there are 34 animal sacrifices. Now that's a lot of sacrifices. And the reason for that is because you cannot understand the plan of salvation without the blood. There is no plan of salvation without the blood of Christ. So the feasts have to have the blood. So that's error number 10. Error number 11. They claim that the feast can be kept anywhere. Yeah. They prefer camping because everybody likes camping. Get your camper, get your tents, go out and go have them out there. But they claim you can do it anywhere. And not only anywhere, but the time they take as the appointed time, the way they understand the Jewish calendar. And of course, they will deny that part too, because if you do the Jewish calendar, you have to do it in Palestine. So that kind of ruins things. If you have to keep Jewish time, if you live in Australia, how are you going to do that? But according to God, according to what Moses wrote down, and according to what we have in the Bible, the feasts could only be observed one place. And that was where God was. And God said, I'm going to be at the tabernacle on this date. You come there and you do the feast. You come there. Only one place. That's where I want all the men. The temple, of course, is the other word for the place that God came in Jerusalem. So then, what happened to the Jews wanting to keep their feasts after AD 70? No place to keep the feast. No place to keep the feast. No priests, because only a priest could be involved in the killing of the animals. No one could stay at home and kill their animals for a Passover or for anything. For Tabernacles, God did not want anybody, because the law of the feasts was for the nation. No individual could keep the feast by himself. The feast people don't seem to understand that. People don't have the option to decide they want to keep a feast. The whole nation does it or it's over. And for the Jews, it's over. So there's nobody that can keep the feast, because God didn't say, I want you at a certain campground at a certain time. He never did that. No campgrounds involved today. They're inventing all of this stuff. What they don't seem to understand is that when Ellen White uses the word tabernacle and she says, it would be well for us to keep a Feast of Tabernacles, she was talking about a camp meeting where we bring people to help them find Jesus. That's what camp meetings were for. They weren't for people to have a camp out. It was to teach the people about Jesus and get people baptized. Put up a tent. Put out the word. Invite the whole town. Invite the whole county. Bring everybody here. Our camp meeting, our Feast of Tabernacles is a time of joy to win souls. What I meant to say when I started that was the specific term in the days of Ellen White. That's the name they gave to camp meeting. Tabernacles. That's what they all called it. They knew when they said tabernacles, it's a camp meeting. And they didn't invent it. The Millerites had camp meetings every month as they were leading up to 1844. Every month. I have read through their schedules. And every one of them, in their papers, they said, this is going to be a beautiful time of tabernacles. And every month was a new tabernacles. Do you think they were actually keeping the Jewish tabernacles by doing it every month? Of course not. It only happened once a year for the Jews. You think the Millerites didn't know that? So, tabernacles means camp meeting. That's all it means after the death of Christ. All right, let's continue here. There's another aspect to this. This is more for the lunar Sabbath people. The feasts always had to have something to do, not only with blood, but with the agricultural system. You had to plant things. You had to offer them to God. The harvest belonged to God. The wave sheaf, for example, that was the first fruits. You had to have a crop at the right time to do the feast. Now, the problem is that since the lunar year is shorter than the solar year, within 3 years, you were a month behind and the crops were growing at the wrong time. So they had to change the calendars and make it come out so that the crops were still there when they came to the right feast. And so they kept adjusting the lunar calendar, and the way they did that was after every third year they added a new month, an extra month. So there was 13 months in that year. And they had to do that adjustment every 3 years. And after 19 years, they were back to the beginning again, so they could start over again to keep the cycles so that the feast could have the right crops. Okay? So the new moons are only good for certain things. And it's not to keep track of the seventh day. It has nothing to do with the seventh day. That's absolute foolishness again. All right, continuing. Error number 12. In Leviticus 23:14, the word forever is used. The feasts will be kept forever. And they say, see, not only were they before sin in heaven, before sin on the earth, but they're going to be forever. And by this time, the people are so hooked, I think they'll believe anything. What does the word forever mean in the Bible? In the Greek, aion ton aion. Jonah, I was in the belly of that big fish forever. How long was forever? See? Forever is only as long as something is happening that's going to finish. That's what forever is in the Bible. So in Leviticus 23, when it says the feast days are going to be forever, what does it mean? until they're finished. Until they're done away. And the Bible is so clear. It ended at the death of Christ. I'm still having a hard time understanding why anybody can think they're still here. But they're out there, and I get emails all the time about people saying, these people are after me. They won't let me go, and they keep coming up with these Bible texts and spirit prophecy. They don't say that to me. Well, I don't think they say that to anybody except the people who are following this, whoever it is that got the light. That's why I want to know who that is. Because there has to be somebody, this stuff did not come out of the wall. Somebody has convinced people, I have new light. I want to see that person. I want to talk to that person. And I want to be convinced by the Spirit of God that He really did tell that person, this is new light for the Seventh-day Adventists. I want to have that experience. I'm not holding my breath. Error. Number 13, I think we're up to. Yes. The feast people have been told that the word statute and judgment means feast. And of course, all you have to do is look in the dictionary. And the word statute never means feast. It always means law. And it always means law in the spirit of prophecy. And it's the only thing the pioneers ever called statutes was law, because they all knew the reality of the Bible truth. A statute is a law. Ellen White is very clear that the statutes, and the Bible is clear on this too, 21 and 22 of Exodus. It's very clear that the statutes tell you the details of what the Ten Commandments are saying. It says in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, what's that? What does that involve? Well, let me tell you, the statutes are very particular. It says, don't you do this, don't you do that, don't you do that, don't you... That's just a long list of explaining what God meant in that commandment. And there's just no way to get around all this stuff once you read it there. So the statutes are the Ten Commandments explained. They're like mini laws, but they're real laws. You can get stoned by not doing a statute. Yeah. So that's what the statutes are. But if you ask a feast person, they've been fooled into saying the statutes are the feasts. No, they're not. You can't show that anywhere in the Bible. And of course, the judgments are about what you do about the people that are wiping out the statutes. So the statutes that God gave to Moses are still here today. There's still the law explaining the Ten Commandments. They're still here today. And so they twist that all around and say, well, Ellen White says the statutes are still here. They're still binding. See, the feasts are still here. No, she did not say the feasts. She said the statutes. The statutes are the laws. Enough on that. That's error number 13. Error number 14. They say that the word feast also comes out festivals. And the festivals are another way of getting back to the statutes. That's all twisted up. I don't even want to go into that. We read, I hope you can remember some of these things. Ellen White said the statutes and the judgments are the duty of man to God and his duty to man. What's that sound like? That's the first commandments, 10 commandments, and the last 6. Duty to God, duty to man. That has nothing to do with feasts. Here's the way you can remember past all these errors. The feasts are all about the work of Christ in saving man. The feasts have nothing to do with the law of God. They're about the work of Jesus. Error number 15. We read Malachi 4:4. He says that it's a command from God, remember the statutes and the judgments. Well, it does say that in Malachi 4:4. What did they make out of that? They say, see, God said to remember the feast days. Because they think statutes mean feast. No. Statutes is law, so God is telling us to keep the law of God, and here's the details. Here's every little detail. I have a quote I wanted to read here. No, I'm not going to read that one now. Okay, let's continue. Error number 16. This one is a most interesting error because I had this one sent to me personally by somebody. They said they sent this in a letter to another person who was asking about the feast, and they said, we thought maybe you'd like to know about this one too. Yeah. Daniel 7:25. We know Daniel 7:25 is about the Pope, times and laws. Okay? Thinks he can change. He thought he could change times and laws. They claim that the word there about times and laws is the feasts. That the Catholic Church changed the feasts, and that's what Daniel was saying. They would take away the feast that we're still trying to keep. The Catholic Church tried to do that to us feast keepers. Well, you can look all through history all you want, and you will never find that the Catholic Church did anything about the Jewish feasts. The Catholic Church didn't come along until after God did the job in AD 70. And after Jesus said it, while he was still alive, your house is left unto you desolate. It was finished way back there, the whole system. But they completely distort Daniel 7 and make it sound like God was telling us the Catholic Church would take it away, and God doesn't want them to take it away because he's going to keep the feast forever. That's what they do with all of this. And I really feel sorry for the people who keep hearing this stuff, and eventually they believe this stuff. For some reason, they have forgotten how to study the Bible and know what a Seventh-day Adventist is supposed to be. Error number 17. Daniel 7:25. They use the word seasons, which is back to Moed, which is dealing with time, appointed times. We're back to Genesis 1:14, and they say Daniel is talking about the same thing that Genesis is talking about. But he didn't really do that. Oh, I lost the whole thing here. The word seasons means seasons in Genesis 1:14. It says there's going to be a rule for the night and a rule for the day. They will measure seasons. What measures seasons? The sun measures the seasons. How many seasons are there? See? We have 4 seasons. We know what they are. We have names for them. We know when they start. We know when they end. The sun measures all of that. Now I shouldn't say nobody, but most people don't go out and plant crops in the wintertime. Okay? That doesn't work. The moon keeps track of certain things too. The agricultural cycle has something to do with the moon. But remember, the moon's not an accurate measurement, so they had to add that 13th month. They had to do that or everything went haywire. But the sun measures seasons. It also measures the year so that who knows when the seasons change. Jeremiah tells us the birds know. That's when they migrate. 2 times a year they migrate, going and coming. And the word in the Hebrew that says what they're doing, it says they migrate at the moed, the appointed time. So they're being told by the seasons when to migrate, and that's moed. That's not the feast. The birds are not keeping feasts. And the word moed is used other times in the Bible that way. And you can know very clearly it's not talking about feasts in those places. So these people, when they say moed means feast, that's just what they've been told. It's not true. It's not true. Let me see. Where are we here? You remember which area we went? Did you notice where they put moed, the feasts, before the creation of the world? Did you notice that? The angels, they say, were keeping the feasts before Lucifer fell. So that means the feasts were being kept before the world was created. Now, who's going to be crazy enough to believe that God was keeping feasts of salvation for the world before it was created? It's just hard to keep up with all this stuff. Jeremiah 8:7, if you want the birds migrating. That's where he uses the word moed. And that birds are not keeping feasts, I know that. It also talks about when the grapes are going to be ready for harvest. Hosea 2:9. Error number 19. Are you ready for this one? Just sit down and relax. Here it comes. At the commencement of the time of trouble, we proclaimed the Sabbath more fully. I say, see, we're proclaiming the feasts now. The annual Sabbaths. Do you get it? And you sit there and wonder, how in the world does anybody listen to this stuff? Well, let me tell you, they're listening to it every week, because it's now their religion. And I'm just telling you the theology. I'm not telling you about some of them, what they're wearing. The horns they're blowing. I'm not telling you about a lot of the stuff that some of these people do. Not all of them. But when you do one crazy thing, you're open to anything. All you have to do is have a little more time. So now, proclaiming the Sabbath more fully means they're going to be out there hollering about the feast days. The seventh-day Sabbath just flew out the coop. Who cares about the seventh-day Sabbath? We're talking about feasts. We're wiping out the Seventh-day Adventist message for this. Have you noticed? This has nothing to do with the Seventh-day Adventist three angels messages. Nothing. That's why I want to know who it is that came up with this light. I want to ask them some questions. Error number 20. I can hardly say some of these. Jesus said he would eat the Passover with us in heaven. Now then, are you catching on how these people get hooked? They say, well, I've seen that somewhere. I've heard that somewhere. Yeah, he really said that. Well, I guess we're going to eat the Passover in heaven. How can we eat the Passover in heaven when God did away with it in AD 70? How? You can't make those two thoughts come together. Jesus must have been saying something that we can be tricked into if we're not careful. Let me read something. Desire of Ages 652. He Jesus, would thus bring to an end the system of types and ceremonies that for 4,000 years had pointed to his death. As he ate the Passover with his disciples, and there are people denying that he ate the Passover, yes. As he ate the Passover with his disciples, he instituted in its place. What did he institute? The service, which was to be the memorial of his great sacrifice. The national festival of the Jews was to pass away forever. How long is that? When Jesus says it. So when he said, I will eat the Passover, when did he say that? He had just finished eating the Jews' Passover, and he said that's the last one forever. Now he makes the Lord's Supper. He says, and I'm not going to do this again until I come back again, and we will do this in heaven. We are going to have the Lord's Supper with him. But it's going to be a different kind of supper. I don't want to get into all of that. The point is, when he said the Passover, he was not saying the Jewish Passover. He said, I will not drink this cup with you again. Do you see it? It's what he did after the Jewish Passover was done. He's going to have the Lord's Supper with them again. And all of us will have communion with Jesus in person in heaven. That's what he's saying. But the poor people have been fooled with all these other errors. They can only hear one thing, what they want to hear. They can't hear the real truth, the real light. And I'm sorry, it's old light, but that's the way it is. There's nothing new about it. It's been there ever since Adam messed up. Jesus is going to take his people with him and have communion with them in heaven. Continuing. Patriarchs and Prophets 5:39. When the Savior yielded up his life on Calvary, the significance of the Passover, that means the Jewish one, ceased. And the ordinance of the Lord's Supper was instituted as a memorial of the same event of which the Passover had been a type. So Jesus is going to keep the new Passover, not the old Passover, but it's still called the Passover. And the feast people don't get it. It's not a feast. It's the gospel Passover. And Paul is very clear. He says, Jesus is my Passover. I think I'd rather have Jesus as my Passover than go to keep a feast. What do I care about a feast? Jesus is my Passover. Error 21. It's claimed that after the crucifixion and Christ's ascension, that the disciples gathered together to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. Now, do you see how they did that? Pentecost was 50 days later. So they say, see, the Feast of Pentecost is still happening after Christ's death. Do you see the trick in that? Maybe you don't see your way out yet. That's a kind of a tricky thing. Why did they do it at that time? Were they there to keep the Feast of Pentecost for the Jews? Is that what they were there for? Jesus told them, you stay here. You tarry here. And they were tarrying there for how many days? This is after the 40th day. 10 days. They were there for... Why were they there for 10 days? They were all together in this little place. All these people, I wonder if they had a place to sit. I don't think so. All these people for 10 days. That could make you grouchy. Yeah. But what they were doing for 10 days was coming together in the Spirit. They were coming of one accord. All they could think about, Jesus told us to wait here. We're waiting. What's he going to do? Well, he was up there having his coronation. And the oil was being placed on him to signify his Holy Spirit. And the oil went flowing down and came off of his feet and came to the earth in the form of fire. His Spirit was on the earth. I've been coronated. I'm the king and I give you my Spirit. He put the Holy Spirit on them. That's why they were there. They were not keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm sorry, Feast of Pentecost. That's not why they were there. They were there because Jesus, stay here until I do this. Now, he did it at the right time. And that's the whole point. Jesus, after he died, is the only one that can keep the feasts and do them at the proper time. We don't worry about feasts anymore. We don't think about feasts. That was for the Jews. We think about Jesus, and he is doing everything that's necessary in the plan of salvation, and he's doing them at the right time. Okay. I'd like to say more about some of these things, but we're getting there just in time. We're going to finish today. I'm not going to go back to the feast again, unless somebody writes me something that's so horrible, we have to talk about it. Okay, error 22. We now need to keep the Passover because it's no longer a Jewish festival. It's now an international festival. Well, they're right, it is international, but they keep playing these little tricks. It's international, but it's not a festival. It's international because every Christian has Jesus. And whatever Jesus is doing, it's for a Christian, for all Christians. So the word international is okay. Just throw out that word festival, feast. It keeps coming in here all the time. We don't need it. It has nothing to do with Christianity. I'm going to read you how they distort a particular passage of Ellen White. Desire of Ages 652. The national festival of the Jews was to pass away forever. The service which Christ established was to be observed by his followers in all lands and through all ages. They say, see? For the Jews, it was gone. But for everybody else, it's for all ages. That's what they do with that. That's ridiculous. What Ellen White said was, the national festival of the Jews is gone. Jesus died. And from then on, what he instituted, the new Passover, the Lord's Supper, and also the foot washing. We can't leave that out because that's part of the new Passover. Okay? The washing of the feet and the drinking of the wine and the cup, that is still here for all ages, for all people. That's international. So they really destroyed this little passage of Ellen White and made it say something she never meant to say because there's too many other places where she says that you can't mistake it. Okay. If you read the entire chapter where that quote is found, you'll see how many times she says it, by the way. She doesn't say it once. You can see how she really hit this. Error number 23. It's claimed that Paul kept the Passover at Philippi. Acts 26. Therefore, we're required to keep the feast today. Well, if you read the chapter before the quote, it's Acts of the Apostles 3:90, I think. You'll have to look that one up. That's what's coming to me. If you read 389. Yeah, it's 389. She tells us why Paul was there at Philippi. He missed his boat. It didn't work out. He was trying to get to Jerusalem for the feast. But she says why he was going there for the feast. It was so he could talk to the Jews, because all the Jews of the world were gathered. That's a good place to talk to them. So he was trying to get there to the feast to talk to them. He was not a feast keeper. Every Gentile he ever talked to, he says, don't mess with the feast. That was just for the Jews. So Paul was at Philippi instead of at the feast of Jerusalem. And he was at Philippi with the Gentile church he had raised up. They're Gentiles. What do they know about feast keeping? He certainly didn't teach them anything about it. He told them, don't do it. That's just for the Jews, and they don't even have it anymore. But he was at Philippi with the Gentiles, and Ellen White says he kept the feast at Philippi. What does she mean? She says 8 days. He was there 8 days with the Gentile Christians. Why was he there 8 days with the Gentile Christians? And she said he kept the feast. What does she mean he kept the feast? He kept the time of the feast. How could he keep the feast without a priest? How could he keep the feast without killing animals? She doesn't say anybody killed animals at Philippi. He kept the time of the feast that he meant to do at Jerusalem with the Gentiles. And it says he enjoyed a peaceful time with them. He had peace because there were no Jews. So the important thing is he was not keeping the feast. He kept the time of the feast. She just didn't put the word time in there, but we are supposed to understand that's what she's talking about. Because she said 8 days. What is that? That's time. That's what she was discussing. All right. It's the only time she ever mentions him with the word kept, but she did not mean keeping the Jewish feast the way the Jews do it. You go study that. Read it carefully. It also says that he stayed for the Feast of Unleavened Bread in another place. That's 8 days, Passover, okay? He did this to be where Jews were, always. Then he says in 1 Corinthians, after discussing what the Feast of Unleavened Bread is, he says, don't have malice. That's sin. Then he says, after all of that, let us keep the feast. What do you think he meant? Let us not do the malice of sin. Let us keep the feast. The unleavened bread, which is a symbol of no sin after you've had the Passover, the blood. So no blood, you have the blood and then you don't have sin in your life. Let's keep that feast, the unleavened bread. He meant spiritually, of course. He didn't say anything about doing what the Jews do. You do what Christians do. I have some things to read on that, but we're running out of time here. I think we have run out of time. Let me do just one last one. Sketches from the Life of Paul, page 105. That's a tremendous book. That book, she says it over and over and over again about what really happened to the feast. I'll just read one little part. It says, Paul did not bind himself nor his converts to the ceremonies and customs of the Jews with their varied forms, types, and sacrifices, for he recognized that the perfect and final offering had been made in the death of the Son of God. And she says many times in discussing these things that the Jews were very slow to get this. The Gentiles got it right away, but the Jews were not getting it. They wanted to hold on to their ceremonies. And so Paul was trying to teach them, but they weren't getting it. Error number 24. That's the last one. It's claimed that the battle of Armageddon will be fought by the whole world over which holy days to keep. Sunday or the feast days. Please don't smile. This is not funny. This is not funny. That's what they're teaching. That the issue for today and the whole world's going to end over Sunday and the feast days. Where did the Sabbath go? Do you see what's happening? These people are not teaching anything about Seventh-day Adventism. They're teaching how to become a Jew. Only you don't do what Jews do, because you don't have priests and you don't have a temple and you don't have sacrifices, but somehow you're a Jew anyhow. But one person wrote me who thinks they're keeping feasts. That person said, well, we don't want to be Jews. What in the world are they doing? Who do they want to be? They don't want to be like Paul. They don't want to be like Ellen White. They don't want to be like any of the pioneers. Who do they want to be like? All right, I'm going to repeat my question one last time so nobody misses it. I want to know who in this world today has spoken with the authority of a prophet from God that is on an equal with Ellen White and says they have new light for Seventh-day Adventists to teach the world, and that new light is about the Sabbath. I want to know the name of that person, who the new prophet for this church is. Father, we thank you for your great love to us. The human mind is so susceptible to perversion. We seem to grasp at just anything rather than to look at who we really are and that we need transformation. We're not willing to face that Jesus is not really being reflected in our lives. We'd rather do theology. We'd rather find something new and exciting. We'd rather find some excuse to indulge ourselves. Help us to know the only life that Jesus is giving us is his life, and that's a life of self-sacrifice. We pray that we may live that life by his Spirit. In Jesus' holy name. Amen.